Alright, good evening folks, it's Enforcer Matt and welcome back to another Short War Summary, and today we're receiving breaking news of apparently a Russian officer opening fire on Russian servicemen, and then servicemen from another unit coming back and then killing the Russian officer on the way out. They apparently ambushed him as he was leaving, so we have a major story on that front of Russian fratricide, and we also have some information about some Ukrainian grain ships making it to Ukrainian port to pick up grain and take it for export to other countries. We have also big news in some other categories as well, but with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into our first piece of news for the day, which is about that Russian officer shooting that occurred apparently a couple weeks back that we just learned about today. And this post is from Global Military Info, and it says, "This is something. A Russian officer opened fire on other Russian soldiers in the Kherson region after an argument. And then the officer tried to flee, but other Russian soldiers engaged his vehicles on the way out." And apparently this happened around Paradise, which is apparently what this place is called, and it was not a good day in Paradise, apparently on this day. And according to the information we have from Astro sources, the Russians are investigating this entire situation, and according to preliminary data, serviceman A.A. Misurev had an argument with a commander, Kugai, and apparently during the conflict, this officer, began shooting from a machine gun, shooting Commander Kugai and other servicemen, and they both died. And after this, that same officer tried leaving the scene in a car, but other servicemen showed up, opened fire with him on a machine gun as well, and that officer died on the spot. And a criminal case has been opened by the Russians, but apparently it has not been initiated or taken on fully yet. So this is probably one of the most notable instances of Russian officers getting basically killed by their own on the front lines. And this is certainly a groundbreaking story to say the least. Of course, we've seen instances in the past where the Russians do open fire on each other, but this is somewhat of a higher level because this is a Russian officer doing it and then getting ambushed by his own people. So a very big story here, and we're going to have to wait for more information to come out about it because it is very preliminary at the moment. But anyways, moving on to our next post here, we have one from Visegrad 24. And this is also a very big story as well. Apparently, according to Visegrad, the first two ships have entered Ukrainian port since Russia withdrew from the Black Sea Grain Initiative in July. And the two bulk carriers used Romania's and Bulgaria's territorial waters to pick up nearly 20,000 tons of Ukrainian grain that will head for Africa and Asia. So we do know for a fact after this post that these ships have made it to Ukrainian port, and they're using that new corridor, which uses Romania and Bulgaria's territorial waters, to get there. So apparently they bypassed the Russian blockade that is still there to this day, and we'll have to wait and see if they can actually get out with the grain, because I'm sure the Russians are noticing that they made it there, so we'll have to see if the Russians move to try to prevent them from leaving. But right now, they have made it to port, which is certainly an accomplishment all on its own. So hopefully that grain can get out from Ukraine once more. And moving on to our next post here, y'all remember that the Samam, which was attacked a few days ago by Sea Baby drones from Ukraine, we're seeing pictures come out of apparently that boat being towed back to port by tugs after it was struck by that drone. And like Visegrad says here, the Russian Black Sea Fleet is taking a serious beating right now. And it certainly is, and here is that picture enlarged. As you can see, here is the Samam, quote-unquote, hovercraft. It's more like a Corvette-class Russian ship. It's being towed back to port by two Russian towboats here. And as you can see in the back, it is definitely sagging down into the water. I presume if you could see the other side of the vessel, you would see a hole in the side of it, which probably flooded at least one compartment in the vessel. So this thing right here can't move on its own propulsion and has to be towed back to port. So Ukraine was successful in its attack. Even though this vessel isn't destroyed, it still is inoperable and will need some serious repairs. So good to see that on that front. And moving on to our next post here, we have one from Flash News Ukraine. It says Russia has redeployed 3 large amphibious assault ships from the Black Sea to the Sea of Azov, says Ukrainian Navy spokesperson Dmytro Pletenchuk. And according to him, this happened after the strikes on the landing ship Minsk and the submarine Rostov-on-Don and Sevastopol. And apparently, this is the Russians' way of trying to protect the remaining ships that they have by moving them from the Black Sea to the Sea of Azov. I'm not sure if that's really going to protect them, if that is their motive for doing so, but they are moving their ships around, I'm assuming, to try to protect them and save the Navy that they have left. Obviously, the Russian Navy is taking a hell of a beating right now, like I said previously, and the Russians can't afford to lose too many more boats, or otherwise, they might not have much of a Navy left. So, with that piece of news out of the way, let's go ahead and move to our next one. and this one is from Ukrainska Pravda in English. And we're seeing a pretty big departure from the United States' previous policy of not allowing Ukrainians to use American weapons on Russian soil. It says here, according to Ukrainska Pravda, that it's up to the Ukrainians how they use the ATACMS, and that was allegedly said by U.S. Secretary of State Blinken. And before, the Ukrainians would have been advised by the U.S. not to use ATACMS on Russian soil, but apparently now, according to Blinken, it's okay if they do so, and I presume the restrictions have been lifted off those weapons. So if that is the case, that makes the ATACMS much more potent because now the Ukrainians can use them without any repercussions from the West to attack the Russians on their own home turf. And I'll have to wait and see if that actually happens, but I have a feeling the Ukrainians are going to be pretty thrilled about that. And moving on to our next post here, we have one from Nexta, and it is about some withdrawals of Russian military troops from the border with Norway. And it says right here that Russia has withdrawn its military from the border with Norway, and only about 20% of the number of soldiers stationed there before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine are currently deployed near the border. And what I take this to mean is Russia is losing so many troops in Ukraine, they're having to take away troops that they typically have bordered with Norway, I presume to scare them and intimidate them, to put them back into Ukraine so that way they can simply fight the very poorly fought war that they're trying to fight right now because they're deeply entrenched in their dugouts and their positions, and right now they're struggling for manpower. So Russia is not in good shape in Ukraine, and they're having to basically draw on troops from everywhere that they have around borders to try to hold their entire situation together. So this indicates to me that the Russians are in deep trouble with their defensive war at this point, trying to defend from that Ukrainian offensive. And moving on to our next post here, we have one from Visegrad 24. And it says Poland's Prime Minister Mateusz says Poland will build a border wall along its border with Kaliningrad, Russia, and Poland has built a razor wire fence there, but now it's being upgraded to the same type of wall that it has on the border with Belarus, which is this type of wall right here, which as you can see is pretty fortified. It has some very sharp barbed wire going along the top of it, as well as large metal panels going deep into the ground to prevent anyone from digging under it. This is a pretty effective wall right here, and I think that's pretty wise to do because obviously a wall prevents people from physically crossing right over. There are arguably ways to get in anyway, but this makes it much harder for people to simply walk in, and I think that's a good thing. So, with that piece of news out of the way, we're moving on to our next one. We learned from the Clash report that the Pentagon has provided the Ukraine with industrial-sized 3D printers that Kyiv can now use to 3D print spare parts for military equipment. And the printers were the size of a truck and, quote-unquote, a game changer in how quickly the Ukrainians could repair their weapons. So apparently these 3D printers are able to print spare parts for various equipment. As long as the Ukrainians know how to use 3D CAD software, they can print something to fix their vehicles. That is revolutionary in my opinion, and I'm glad to see that Ukrainian has gotten these 3D printers. And we also have a video right here showing how that actually works. I'm going to mute that right there so that we don't play that music. But as you can see, this is a very large 3D printer. I'm not sure if Ukraine got one of this size, but this one is printing an entire hull of a boat. So these things are very effective, and I'm surprised that Ukraine has gotten those, and it apparently just showed up there out of the blue because I hadn't heard anything about it prior. So very good news for Ukraine, and I'm sure they're thrilled to get those 3D printers. And moving on to our next one here, we have a post from Ukrainska Pravda in English that says the White House is confident that Congress will pass support packages for Ukraine despite disagreements. And we're not going to get into the politics of the situation. That is not what we do here on this channel. We're all about Ukraine, and I'm simply glad to see that apparently there is support to pass this package, and we'll hear more about this when Zelensky arrives in about a week to the United States, when that package will be awarded to him. So good news for Ukraine. The aid is still going to them, and there doesn't appear to be any signs of it stopping. And moving on to our next post here, we have one from Nexta, and this is about Sweden's potential accession into NATO. We're seeing now that apparently Erdogan is flip-flopping once again, and even though Erdogan had previously agreed to let Sweden into NATO, he's apparently backing out of that agreement. It says here that Erdogan says Sweden has still not fulfilled the promises made to Turkey to join NATO, and even worse than that, the EU and Turkey may take different paths. So we're seeing here that something is going on with Turkey that is causing some tension between them and the EU, and now that's causing Erdogan to basically back out of his promise to let Sweden into NATO. So this could be a potential roadblock to the entire Sweden accession that we didn't see coming previously. I didn't personally think that Erdogan would back out of this. I thought it was pretty much set in stone at this point. But I forgot we're dealing with Turkey, and nothing with Turkey goes the way it should because they change their minds so frequently. So unfortunate to hear, and hopefully they can get Erdogan to come back and honor his agreement and let Sweden in. And moving on to our last post of the day, we have one from the Kyiv Independent. And take this with a grain of salt, because this is a claim by Moscow. Allegedly, Russia did not sign an agreement with North Korea on an arms deal when North Korea visited just a short while ago, a few days ago. The Russian dictator Vladimir Putin and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un signed no agreements during their meeting at the Kremlin or in Vladivostok, says Dmitry Peskov. And take that for what you will. I have some doubts about that. I think there might be a secret agreement that they're not telling us about, but we'll have to wait and see. But right now, the official story coming out of Moscow, which is worth basically nothing, is that they did not sign an agreement. And with that, that is our last piece of news for the day. Obviously, we're watching several stories very closely, and if you would, please go ahead and press that like button and subscribe as well if you want regular updates about the Ukraine war. We also run a nightly war news stream at 10 p.m. Eastern. A lot of you already watched that already, but if you haven't, be sure to tune in and we'll answer your questions there as well and cover the remaining news of the day. And also, peep our Twitter page at It's the Enforcer on Twitter, and we post the news minute by minute as it occurs. So I hope the video has been informative to you. Thank you for watching, and also, if you want to support this work and help us keep making these videos, you can support us on our Patreon page. The link is in the description below. Thank you all for watching, and bye-bye for now.